My name is Ryan. I'm 32, and I swear that what happened on my mom's birthday still feels like one of those moments where the entire room tilts and you're the only one who notices. I drove to her place that afternoon thinking it would be like any other family get-together we've had over the years, just some loud talking, cheap cake, and awkward laughs. My mom lives in this small single-story house she bought after divorcing my dad, and it's basically the place we grew up in even if it's not technically the same house from our childhood. I pulled into the driveway, and the first thing I noticed was my brother's truck parked sideways like he rushed in without even trying to park straight. My brother, Mark, is 34 and has this habit of walking into every place like people were waiting for him to arrive. I hadn't seen him for a couple weeks, which already told me he was probably planning something or had some scheme going on. Walking into the house, I smelled my mom's cooking, that mix of roasted chicken and garlic bread she always makes on her birthday, because she refuses to let anyone else cook. She hugged me at the door, and something in her face looked tired, but I thought it was just stress from hosting. Mark was already in the living room, legs spread out on the couch like he was holding court or something. He gave me this weird smile, like he'd been waiting for me specifically. I tried to shake it off, grabbed a soda, and sat at the kitchen table while my mom finished icing her own cake. She always insists on making her own cake, says buying one feels lazy. Everything felt normal for like 5 minutes, just basic family energy, nothing out of the ordinary. Then Mark kept walking around the house like he owned it, touching stuff, opening drawers, acting weird. I watched him from the kitchen doorway, trying to understand what vibe he was riding on. He looked proud, like he'd already won something. My mom kept glancing his way, and I could tell she was annoyed but trying to keep the peace. I figured he was just being his usual self, trying too hard to be the center of attention. But the energy in the room felt heavier than normal. I remember thinking that something was building up, like he had something to say and was waiting for the perfect moment to drop it. I wish I had asked her earlier if anything was going on, because by the end of the night, the whole tone of the day would flip completely. And honestly, none of us were prepared for it. Not even him, though he thought he was. And definitely not me. Dinner started fine, or at least it looked fine on the surface, but there was this tension hanging over the table that wouldn't go away. My mom served plates like she always does, putting extra food on Mark's plate because he never eats enough, which is a joke between them even though he eats like a linebacker. I was across from him, and the entire time he kept smirking like he was holding the punchline to a joke nobody else knew. Every time my mom tried to talk about something innocent, like the neighbor's new dog or her coworker retiring, he would interrupt with these random comments about future plans and big changes coming soon. I thought he meant he was moving again or switching jobs like he always does when things get too real. But the way he kept glancing at me made it feel personal. My mom pretended not to notice, but she's terrible at hiding discomfort. She kept tapping her fork against her plate in that nervous rhythm she does when she's anxious. I remember trying to make small talk just to cut the tension, but it didn't help. The whole thing felt like watching someone set up a stage without telling the cast what show they're in. At one point, Mark leaned back and started talking about property taxes, out of nowhere, like that was a normal birthday conversation. He mentioned home values rising, how it's smart to think ahead, how some people just don't understand long-term planning. I rolled my eyes at him, but he didn't even look at me. He just kept talking like he was building up to something. My mom finally told him to stop with the cryptic comments and just say whatever he wanted to say. He grinned like he'd been waiting for someone to open the door for him. He lifted his glass, looked at both of us, and I swear the air got heavier. I felt this weird knot in my stomach like instinct was warning me. Mark loves dramatic moments, but this one felt different. He wasn't joking around. He looked like someone who had convinced himself he deserved something. And I didn't know yet, but he had convinced himself of something way bigger than any of us realized. The way he smiled before opening his mouth still pisses me off, because he really thought he was doing the right thing. Or maybe he just thought saying it out loud would make it true. Either way, everything crashed right after that. So right after he made that stupid toast, he put the glass down and said, totally casual, that he wanted to finally make it official about inheriting the house. At first I honestly thought he was joking, because he jokes about everything, and because who announces that on someone else's birthday dinner? I waited for him to laugh or say something dumb to break the tension, but he didn't. He leaned forward like he was expecting applause. My mom froze for a second, her fork in midair, completely blindsided. She asked him what he was talking about, and he shrugged like it was obvious. He said she had basically promised him the house years ago, which was insane because I've never once heard her say anything like that. He started listing random things, like how he helped her paint the living room once, and how he spent 2 months living with her after his last breakup. To him, that apparently meant she owed him the entire house. I remember my chest tightening because the whole thing sounded unreal, like he had rewritten history in his head. My mom's face turned red in that way she gets when she's embarrassed and angry at the same time. She kept saying she never promised that, but he wouldn't let it go. He insisted it was understood, that he knew how families worked, and that the oldest usually gets the property. That part especially pissed me off because we're 2 years apart, not some royalty line. He said he had plans and needed certainty, and the house was part of those plans. It felt like he had rehearsed that speech in the mirror a dozen times. I think he expected her to just nod and confirm it. But she didn't. She told him flat out that she never made such a promise. And you could see the exact moment he realized she meant it. His whole expression changed, like he'd been slapped. He kept blinking fast like he was recalibrating. I felt this heavy awkwardness, like I was sitting too close to an argument I wasn't supposed to see. But then he turned to me, and that's when things got even more twisted. Because he suddenly decided I was the reason she was saying no. Which made absolutely no sense, but in his mind, it explained everything. And he ran with it. Mark pointed at me, literally pointed, and said I had obviously been trying to turn her against him for years. I just stared at him in total disbelief because I barely even talked to the guy outside family gatherings. He said I always acted superior because I had a more stable job and didn't bounce around every couple of months like he does. It felt like he'd been storing those lines for a long time, waiting for the perfect moment to throw them out. My mom tried to shut him down, telling him not to drag me into his fantasy, but he wasn't listening. He kept ranting about how I did nothing for her and how he was the one who showed up when she needed help. Which is hilarious because he only shows up when he needs something from her. But the thing that hit me hardest was when he said I didn't deserve anything from her. As if we were all sitting there dividing her life like a will reading. I told him he was being ridiculous, and he snapped back, telling me I was jealous because I knew the house wasn't meant for me. I wasn't jealous, I was shocked. I couldn't believe he was turning our mom's birthday into this delusional property fight. He started pacing, waving his hands around like some lawyer building a case that only made sense in his head. My mom looked like she was going to cry, which made me angrier than anything he'd said. She kept saying this wasn't the time or place, but he just kept going like he was possessed by his own narrative. I could feel myself getting hot, like the room was shrinking. Part of me wanted to yell back, but the other part just couldn't believe we were even having this conversation. He accused me of manipulating her, which is insane because my mom and I don't even talk about that kind of stuff. Then he said something like, "You always get in the way," which sounded way more personal than just the house. Like he'd been waiting years to unload that sentence. He wasn't arguing anymore. He was spiraling. And the worst part was that he thought he was right. He thought he was owed something. Something huge. And the fact that she said no lit a fuse in him neither of us saw coming. At one point my mom told him to sit down because he was making a scene, but instead he walked into the hallway like he needed to take control of the space. He started pointing at different rooms, talking about how he already had ideas for renovations and how it would be a waste if the house didn't go to someone who appreciated it. It was like watching someone claim land they didn't own, like some bizarre emotional trespassing. My mom followed him, trying to tell him to stop, but he kept ignoring her, acting like he already lived there. I stayed in the kitchen doorway, watching this weird parade of entitlement move from room to room. He opened the linen closet, nodded like he was inspecting it. He pushed open the guest room door, looked around like a real estate agent. It was surreal. My mom kept telling him she never promised him anything, but he had his fingers in his ears metaphorically. He said she forgot, that she must have said it years ago, and he never doubted it. The worst part was that he sounded genuinely hurt, like she had betrayed him, not the other way around. He looked at her like she was breaking some sacred agreement he invented. At one point he even said, "I need this," and his voice cracked just a little. It didn't excuse anything, but it made the whole thing feel sad instead of just infuriating. I think that was the moment I realized this wasn't just greed. It was desperation wrapped in entitlement. But that didn't make it any less insane. He stormed back to the living room, grabbed his jacket, and said he couldn't believe her. Then he walked out, slamming the door so hard the picture frame shook. My mom stood there staring at the closed door like she was trying to process all of it at once. I didn't say anything for a long moment because I didn't even know where to start. The whole night had flipped upside down in seconds, and neither of us had any idea what he'd do next, or how long this would drag on. But it wasn't over. Not even close. After Mark slammed the door, the whole house went silent in a way that didn't feel normal. It wasn't just the kind of silence after someone storms out. It was heavier, like everything in the air needed a minute to settle back into place. My mom walked slowly to the kitchen, sat at the table, and put both hands over her face. I hadn't seen her do that since I was a kid, and she was dealing with my dad's drinking. I sat across from her, but didn't talk right away because I didn't want to say something that made her feel worse. She finally looked up, eyes red, and apologized for ruining dinner, which felt so backwards I almost laughed. I told her she didn't ruin anything, but she shook her head like she didn't believe me. She said she had no idea why Mark thought he was getting the house. She kept repeating that she never promised him anything, not even hinted at it. I could tell she was replaying every conversation she'd ever had with him, searching for a moment that might have been misunderstood. But there wasn't one. I'd grown up hearing her say she didn't want us worrying about inheritance or who got what. She always said she was going to use her money while she was alive and enjoy her life. Mark knew that too. He just didn't want to accept it. Sitting there, I kept thinking about how quickly he went from celebrating her birthday to destroying the whole mood. She asked me if I thought she had done something wrong by shutting him down. That question alone broke my heart a little because it showed how deeply his reaction shook her. I told her she didn't do anything wrong and that his behavior was on him, not her. But she looked down at the table like she wasn't convinced. She said she didn't want her boys fighting over something she might never even give away. I could feel how tired she was, how drained. It wasn't just the argument. It was the fear of losing family over something she never wanted to be an issue in the first place. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. It was the only thing I could think to do, because at that point, neither of us had any idea how bad things would get, or how much worse Mark would make them in the weeks after. We tried to finish dinner, but it felt pointless. The food was cold, the cake was untouched, and the whole celebration had basically evaporated. My mom kept trying to act like everything was fine, forcing little smiles and saying stuff like, "Let's not let him ruin the night," but it didn't work. The house still felt like it was echoing after the door slam. I helped her pack the leftovers into plastic containers, even though neither of us planned to eat them. Every time she walked past the living room, she'd glance toward the door like she expected Mark to barge back in. I checked my phone a few times, half expecting a long text from him, but my screen stayed empty. I didn't know if that was good or bad. As we cleaned up plates, she asked me if I thought Mark hated me. That question caught me completely off guard because she didn't say it in a dramatic way. She said it like she was genuinely trying to understand something. I told her he didn't hate me. He just lived in his own world. But the truth is, I wasn't entirely sure. Mark always had this competitive streak with me that felt childish and random. It didn't matter what it was: jobs, cars, relationships, even our mom's attention. He'd find a way to turn everything into a scoreboard. And tonight, that scoreboard had turned into a story in his head where I was the villain. She sat at the table again and stared at the birthday candles she never got to blow out. It hit me then how messed up the whole night had been. Her birthday, her one day in the year where she lets herself be celebrated, had turned into this disaster. I felt guilty even though I hadn't done anything. I just didn't know how to fix any of it. She eventually lit one candle by herself and blew it out without making a wish. That moment felt so small and sad that I still think about it. I hugged her before leaving and told her I'd check on her the next day. But walking out to my car, I swear I felt this weird sense that something bigger had been set in motion. Something we weren't going to be able to stop easily. When I got home that night, I kept replaying the whole thing in my head, trying to figure out where it even came from. Mark had always been dramatic, but this was on another level. It wasn't just entitlement. It felt personal, almost like he'd built a whole narrative where he was the chosen one and Mom just had to fall in line. I sat on my couch with the TV on low volume, not even watching it, just needing background noise because the silence felt too heavy. About an hour later, I got a long text from Mark. It was one of those messages where the bubbles kept appearing and disappearing, like he kept rewriting it before sending. When it finally came through, it was a mess of accusations. He said I had poisoned her against him, that I'd talked trash behind his back for years, and that I was trying to steal what was his. It felt like reading a manifesto from someone who wasn't fully grounded in reality. I didn't respond, mostly because nothing I said would get through to him. I could feel how twisted his thoughts were just from the tone, like he had fully convinced himself of this alternate version of our family. He ended the text saying he wasn't done, and that we would all see the truth soon. That line bothered me the most because it didn't sound like anger, it sounded like a warning. I considered calling my mom, but I didn't want to stress her out more than she already was. So I just sat there staring at my phone until the screen went dark. For the first time in a long time, I genuinely felt uneasy about my own brother. Not scared, exactly, but unsettled. Like I wasn't sure what he was capable of when he felt cornered. I tried to sleep, but ended up tossing and turning for hours. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him pacing through the house, claiming rooms like it already belonged to him. It was unsettling. And the worst part was, something in me knew he wasn't going to let this go. The next morning, I drove to my mom's place early because I couldn't shake the feeling that something might have happened overnight. When I got there, her car was still in the driveway, and the house looked exactly the same, which calmed me down a little. She opened the door already dressed and with her hair done, which meant she probably hadn't slept much either. She looked tired, but not in the same emotional way as the night before. More like she had made some kind of decision. She told me she had called Mark early that morning, hoping they could clear things up, but he didn't answer. She said she left him a voicemail telling him she loved him, but couldn't entertain those ideas about the house. That she wasn't dying anytime soon and didn't want to talk about inheritance while she was still alive. I could tell saying that hurt her. It's not easy to talk about your own mortality just because your kid is throwing a tantrum about property. She made coffee for both of us, and we sat in the same spots as the night before. But this time, she wasn't crying. She was angry. She said she wouldn't let Mark bully her into decisions she never made. She said he had crossed a line by attacking both of us like that. It felt strange hearing her talk like that, because she's usually the peacekeeper. But this time she was done. She asked me if I thought she should change her locks, just in case. That question hit hard because it meant she wasn't sure what he might do either. I told her it wouldn't be a bad idea. She sighed and nodded slowly, like she was trying to accept that one of her sons had turned into someone she didn't recognize. Before I left, she hugged me a long time, longer than usual. It felt like she was grounding herself more than hugging me. Driving away, I realized the damage was deeper than just an argument. Something in our family had cracked. Something we might not be able to fix. Over the next week, Mark didn't show up, didn't call, didn't text. My mom checked his social media and saw he was posting vague stuff about family betrayal and being stabbed in the back, which was obviously about us. He made himself look like the victim to people who didn't know the story. The comments on his posts were filled with his friends saying things like, "Stay strong," and "they'll regret it," which only seemed to fuel him more. I try not to let it get to me, but it bothered me that strangers were encouraging him without knowing the damage he caused. My mom tried calling him a few more times, but eventually gave up when he kept ignoring her. She told me she felt like she had lost him even though he was still around. There was this weird grief in her voice, like she was mourning someone who hadn't actually died. I kept checking on her every day, bringing groceries sometimes, or just staying for coffee. She didn't say it, but I could tell she was afraid he might show up angry. I noticed she started locking the door even when she was home, something she never used to do during the day. Eventually, I suggested she stay at my place for a few days just to clear her mind, but she refused. She said she wasn't going to be pushed out of her own home. I respected that, even though part of me wanted her somewhere safer. One night, about 10 days after the birthday fiasco, I got a text from Mark out of nowhere. It was short. Just, "Let's talk. At Mom's. Tomorrow." No apology, no explanation, nothing. I didn't like the sound of it, but I also knew there was no avoiding this forever. So I told him I'd be there. And then I barely slept again because something about that message felt off. Like the calm before another storm. One we weren't ready for. The next morning, I drove back to my mom's place with this weird heaviness in my chest, like I knew something was coming but couldn't put a name to it. Her neighborhood looked the same as always, quiet and slow. People walking dogs and watering lawns like nothing in the world had shifted. But everything felt off to me. When I pulled into the driveway, Mark's truck was already there, parked straight this time, which was somehow even more unsettling. It was like he had forced himself to act normal. I walked inside without knocking because Mom never locks the door when she knows I'm coming. She was sitting on the couch, hands clasped tightly, staring at the floor. The TV was on but muted. Mark stood by the window, arms crossed, looking like he'd been waiting for me. My stomach dropped a little seeing the two of them in the same room after all the tension. Nobody said anything when I walked in. It felt like stepping into a room where a bomb was ticking and everyone was pretending they couldn't hear it. I sat down next to my mom, and she didn't look at me, which told me everything I needed to know about how nervous she was. Mark finally cleared his throat like he wanted to take control of the room. He said he wanted to fix things, but the way he said it didn't sound like someone trying to apologize. It sounded like someone negotiating from a position he thought was strong. My mom nodded for him to continue. Even though I could see in her face, she wasn't buying any of it. He said he had thought a lot about what happened and still believed he was in the right about the house. That sentence alone made my jaw clench. But he said he was willing to compromise. Compromise what? I had no idea. The whole thing felt like a business meeting in the worst possible way. I glanced at my mom, waiting for her to react. But she stayed quiet. And that silence made Mark think he had room to keep going. Which was exactly what he did. Mark started pacing again, but slower this time, like he was trying to show he was calm and rational. He said he didn't want the entire house anymore. Not necessarily, as he put it, which already sounded ridiculous. Then he said he wanted Mom to at least put it in writing that he'd get a portion of it when she died. Hearing him say that out loud in front of her made my skin crawl. My mom's mouth fell open for a second like she couldn't believe he was talking about her death as casually as discussing weekend plans. She asked him why he was so fixated on this, and he said something like, "I need stability," in this frustrated tone. Then he said he wanted proof so he could plan his future, like she was some kind of estate he needed to secure legally. I felt myself getting angry just listening to it. It wasn't just disrespectful. It was cold. My mom told him again, slower this time, that she'd never made any promise and she wasn't signing anything. She said she wasn't ready to talk about inheritances and that he was being inappropriate. Mark's calm expression cracked instantly. He started breathing quicker and his jaw tightened. He said she was being unfair, that she was choosing me over him, that she was punishing him for needing help. The way he twisted everything into a personal attack was unreal. I told him he needed to stop framing everything like some competition, but he snapped at me and said I had no idea how hard life was for him. That line hit a nerve because he acts like he's the only one with struggles. Mom tried to interrupt us, but Mark kept talking over her. The situation was slipping again, fast, like the first time. Mom finally raised her voice for the first time in years. She told him he needed to leave if he wasn't going to speak respectfully. I'd forgotten what her voice sounded like when she was truly angry. Mark froze, stunned. For a second I thought it might have snapped him out of his spiral. But instead, he glared at her like she'd betrayed him all over again. Mark stepped closer to her, not in a threatening way exactly, but close enough that I stood up without even thinking. I moved between them because something in his face looked volatile, like he wasn't fully processing the moment. He said she was acting ridiculously emotional, and that she wasn't thinking straight, which was insane because she was the calmest person in the room until he pushed her too far. He said she was letting me control the situation, which was the last thing anyone could accuse her of. Then he pointed at her again and said she was ruining everything. She told him, voice shaking, that the house wasn't going to be discussed anymore, that she wanted her life free from that pressure. He rolled his eyes like she was being dramatic. Then something in him snapped. He raised his voice and said she was breaking the family apart, that she was choosing sides. He kept saying the word sides, like this was some war and not just a simple boundary she was setting. I stepped closer to him and told him he needed to stop, but he didn't even look at me. He was fixated on her, like everything wrong in his life was suddenly her fault. My mom backed up a step, which she rarely ever does. That's when I felt something shift in me. This wasn't just a fight anymore. This was something darker. Mark said something I'll never forget. He said, "If you don't give me something now, you'll regret it later." It wasn't loud. It wasn't screamed. It was quiet. Almost too quiet. And the way he said it made the hairs on my neck stand up. Because it didn't sound like a threat. It sounded like a promise he believed in. A promise from someone who had slipped into their own world completely. My mom looked at him with this expression I'd never seen on her face before, a mix of fear and heartbreak and disbelief. She asked him what he meant by that, but he didn't answer. He just stared at her like he was waiting for her to understand something he thought was obvious. I stepped fully between them so she didn't have to look at him. I told him he needed to leave. He shook his head slowly, like he was disappointed we weren't seeing things his way. He said we were ganging up on him, and that nobody cared about his future. He said he had a right to the house because he had invested his time into helping her, which still makes no sense. Mom kept trying to get him to look at her so she could talk to him, but he refused. He kept shifting his eyes toward the hallway and the rooms like he still saw them as his. Finally, Mom said she would call the police if he didn't leave. It was the hardest sentence she had said all day. Mark froze for a second, like the word police had disconnected something in his mind. Then he snapped out of it and grabbed his jacket off the chair so aggressively the whole thing tipped over. Mom flinched. He noticed, and that hurt him more than anything, I think. His face twisted, not in anger, but in something like shock. He whispered, "Wow," like he couldn't believe she was scared of him. He walked to the door slowly, each step sounding heavier. He opened it halfway, paused, and looked back at us like he wanted to say something profound. But nothing came out. He just stared, breathing hard. Then he slammed the door again and walked to his truck. We watched through the window as he stood outside for a long minute, just staring at the house. Then he got in and drove off without looking back. Mom collapsed onto the couch like her whole body finally gave out. And I just stood there, feeling this cold emptiness spreading through my chest. We sat there in silence for what felt like half an hour, neither of us knowing how to process what had just happened. Mom kept wringing her hands like she was trying to physically squeeze the memory away. She said she didn't understand how things had gotten this bad, that she didn't recognize the person Mark had become. I told her she wasn't alone in that because I felt the same way. I grabbed her a glass of water and sat next to her, but she barely touched it. She asked me if I thought he would come back. I said I didn't know, which was the truth. Mark wasn't predictable anymore. He wasn't operating on normal logic. She said she felt like she had lost a son, even though he was still alive. Hearing her say that made my chest tighten. No parent wants to feel that way. She said she wished she could rewind everything and figure out where she went wrong. I told her she didn't go wrong anywhere. People make their own choices. But she looked at me like she wasn't convinced. Like she still believed a good mom should have seen this coming. We talked for a while, mostly circling the same questions without any answers. I stayed until she seemed calmer, though I could tell she wasn't okay. Before I left, she hugged me again, tighter than she had in years. She told me she loved both of us, even if one of us had gone off the deep end. I promised her I'd keep checking on her. The whole drive home, I kept replaying Mark's last look at her. It wasn't angry. It was something worse. It was like he felt betrayed by the only person who ever gave him unconditional love. And the thought of what that could turn into scared me more than anything he said. Because once someone convinces themselves they're owed something, they don't always stop when told no. And deep down, I knew this wasn't the end of it. The next few days felt strange, like the air around everything had shifted even though life on the outside looked completely normal. I went to work, did my usual routine, but every time my phone buzzed my stomach tightened. I kept checking in on my mom, sometimes calling twice a day just to hear her voice and make sure she sounded steady. She said she was doing better, but I could tell she was forcing herself to sound okay for my sake. She kept her blinds closed most of the time, something she never did before. She told me she was thinking about getting a security camera installed just because it might help her sleep better. That sentence alone told me everything about the level of anxiety she was still dealing with. Mark still hadn't reached out to either of us, but he kept posting vague, bitter things online. Stuff like some families show their true colors when money is involved, and loyalty means nothing to some people. People commented with supportive messages, completely unaware they were feeding whatever distorted story he had built in his head. Mom tried not to look at his posts, but I know she checked them late at night because she'd call me the next morning sounding shaken. I kept telling her not to take them personally, but she's a mother. Everything he said cut into her. By Friday, she seemed a bit calmer, said she wanted to go grocery shopping for the first time since the fight. She joked about needing real food instead of the leftovers that reminded her of the worst birthday ever. I met her at the store after work just to keep things normal. Nothing dramatic happened. We walked through the aisles like regular people, talking about ordinary things. And for the first time that week, I felt like we were coming out the other side of the whole mess. I drove her home, carried her bags inside, and everything seemed fine. Completely fine. But that feeling didn't last long, because things have a weird way of breaking when you least expect it. Mom called me early the next morning, earlier than she ever calls. Her voice was tight, shaky, but she said she needed me to come over. I asked her what happened, but she just repeated, "Please come." My heart immediately started racing. I threw on clothes and got in my car without even brushing my teeth. Her house is only 15 minutes away, but that drive felt like an hour. When I pulled into the driveway, I saw it instantly. The side door, the one that leads to the laundry room, was cracked open. Not wide open, but just enough to look wrong. Mom was standing on the porch wearing her robe, arms wrapped around herself even though it wasn't cold. I got out and asked her what happened. She pointed to the door without saying a word. I walked over slowly, pushed it open, and saw muddy footprints on the tile floor. Not many, maybe 4 or 5, but definitely not hers. The laundry room light was still on, and the cabinet above the washing machine was open. Nothing looked stolen, nothing was broken, but someone had been inside. Mom said she woke up around 5 a.m. because she heard a thump, like something falling. When she got up to check, she heard the door creak. Whoever had been inside must have slipped out before she reached the hallway. She kept saying, "He wouldn't do this, right?" over and over. But she didn't say his name. She didn't have to. I didn't want to believe it either. But the footprints were too big to be hers. Too wide to be from someone small. Too familiar to ignore. I helped her check the rest of the house, even though she had already looked around before I got there. Everything was where it should be. Her jewelry box untouched. Her wallet on the counter. Her TV still in place. Nothing missing, nothing damaged. Which made it worse somehow. This wasn't a break-in. It was someone coming inside just to be inside. Someone who wanted to be in her space, not take anything from it. Someone who wanted to prove a point. Mom asked if we should call the police, but something about the situation made her hesitate. She didn't want to make things worse if it wasn't Mark. But we both knew it probably was. I told her we should call anyway, but she begged me to wait until she had time to think. She looked embarrassed, like she was ashamed to admit her own son might have crossed that line. I stayed with her for a few hours, drinking coffee at the table and keeping an eye on the back door. Every little noise made her flinch. At one point she asked me if she was overreacting, which made my blood boil because none of this was her fault. She wasn't overreacting. She wasn't reacting enough. Around noon, I walked around outside to check if there were more footprints, but the ground was mostly dry except for one patch of mud near the fence. It didn't lead anywhere useful. Whatever trail existed had already faded. Before I left, she made me promise not to confront Mark. She said she didn't want him spiraling even more if I came at him angry. I told her I wouldn't. But the truth is, I wasn't sure I could keep that promise if I saw him. Because now this wasn't about money or entitlement. It was about safety. And that changed everything. The next few days were weirdly quiet. Mark didn't text, didn't post anything, didn't show up anywhere. It was like he vanished. But the silence didn't feel peaceful. It felt loaded, like we were sitting in the eye of something that hadn't passed yet. Mom didn't want to be alone at night, so I stayed over a couple times, sleeping on the couch. She'd wake up at every little sound, sometimes calling my name just to make sure I was still there. I hated seeing her like that. She kept saying she wished she could understand what was happening in his head. I wished that too, but I also knew that sometimes understanding someone doesn't make them less dangerous. On Thursday night, I heard a noise outside around 2 a.m. Not loud, just a soft crunch like someone stepping on gravel. I got up quietly and peeked through the blinds. I didn't see anyone, but I felt watched. I stayed awake another hour just listening, but nothing else happened. The next morning, Mom said she felt off, like she had dreamed something she couldn't remember.